today's lecture, we will zoom on the origins and the drivers of African pre-colonial states. Yesterday, we had Stelios and Warren Watley discuss research illustrating both how deeply rooted pre-colonial features related to political centralization matter for contemporary African development. So today we will take the next step and we will try to pose actually a very old question in social sciences. What are the driving forces of states and political centralization, zooming into Africa? We are very pleased to have a fantastic set of friends who join us and give us insights about this fascinating topic that spans all social sciences, economics, politics, history. So let me start with Mamelo Selamulela, who is joining us from Johannesburg. Mamelo is the managing executive for group strategy and innovation at Vodacom in South Africa. She holds a master's degree from the University of Cape Town, and she also holds a master's in business administration degree from the London Business School. Mamelo has been a dear friend of her alma mater, London Business School, and she has been helping us a lot with various programs that the school is running in South Africa. Mamelo will coordinate the Q&A sessions. So let me please ask you for once more, keep sending us questions and feedback. We will try to answer some of them during the session today. We will respond to many questions in the end with Mamelo's help. So we will have two guests today. Let me start with Marcela Alsan. Marcela is a professor of public policy at Harvard University at the Kennedy School of Government. Marcela is doing excellent and very influential work on health economics. She graduated from Harvard, then she did a master's in public health, again at Harvard University. Then she decided to be a doctor, and she also practiced medicine for some time, if I'm not mistaken. Actually, interesting, she worked on infectious diseases. Subsequently, Marcela completed her doctorate in economics at Harvard University at the School of at the Department of Economics. She worked for a couple of years at Stanford, and she recently moved back to Harvard. Marcela has done super interesting work. Today, she will discuss about her work about the role of ecology and the tsetse fly on the origins of African state. But let me also flag her very important work about health interventions in the United States. And more recently, she has been working a lot on the effects of COVID in the United States and across the world. Then we also have James Fenske, who is joining us from Coventry. James is professor of economics at the University of Warwick. Before joining Warwick, James worked at the University of Oxford as lecturer and subsequently as associate professor of economics after completing his PhD at Yale University in the United States. James has done very important work on African development more generally. He has studied cultural traits, political centralization, which is going to be the focus of our discussion today. Let me also flag his very important work also outside Africa about the long run history of India, among other places. So Marcela, James, and Mamelo, thanks a lot for being with us. I leave the floor to you. And let me urge all of our viewers to start sending us questions and continue the very lively engagement that we have. Thank you very much.
So thank you first for the opportunity to be here. If I'm going to spend the next 20 minutes talking mostly about pre-colonial African states, I have to convince you that these are something that aren't only of antiquarian interest, that there's something that matters more generally. And I think we, in order to understand Africa, have to take note that the states that existed in pre-colonial Africa shaped everything that came afterwards. They shaped the nature of colonial rule. So systems of indirect rule, they worked on the basis of taking advantage of what existed before, of the power of pre-colonial authorities. We also know that whether or not there was a pre-colonial African state shaped not only whether missionaries arrived in that area, but whether colonial governments were willing to tolerate the presence of missionaries in those areas. In parts of French West Africa that had more developed pre-colonial states, Elise Hillary has shown that resistance to colonial settlement was greater. And we know that the practice of forced labor in the colonial period often drew on pre-colonial precedents. Marloes van Wijnberg has done some interesting work on that. But we know over and above that, pre-colonial African states continue to shape outcomes in the present day. We know from the work of Genioli and Rayner that countries that had more centralized pre-colonial states are better at providing public goods in the present. And so you can see in the figure that I'm showing you, they've been better at reducing problems such as infant mortality in the present. The work of Elios and Stelios that you've seen earlier this week has shown us that not only are there differences across countries on the basis of pre-colonial states, there's differences within countries, that parts of your typical African country that had a more centralized state before colonial rule are better developed today. We also know that a past history of pre-colonial states helps lower levels of civil conflict in the present. Emilio de Petres de Chalvin has done work on that. So what I'm going to do is talk about two of the projects that I've done in the past from kind of a broader perspective, telling you how I engage with the African history literature before taking a particular story that I had read to data. And so I want to begin with one story, and that's about the relationship between geography and the state in Africa. Back in about 2007, I had the privilege of taking an environmental history class from Robert Harms. He was a Jan van Sene student and an expert on the environmental history of Africa. Now, this is a wide-ranging field with a lot in it that's interesting, but a portion of this literature that's been well summarized by Jim McCann in his book, Greenland, Brownland, Blackland, deals with the nature of African states and how they related to the geography around them. So, for example, he'll point out that in the Sahel, some of the pre-colonial states like Ghana, Mali, and Songhai, they only grew strong because they could raise revenue from the smallholder cereal farmers that could exist in that geographic zone, and because they could tax trans-Saharan trade that existed in that geographic zone. As the Sahara has grown and receded in periods of either greater moisture or lower moisture, that's affected whether or not cavalry can survive in the wetter, tsetse-infested zones to the south, and that's affected the rise and fall of African states. Similarly, Great Zimbabwe, which you see in the figure below, is a state that thrived on being able to have cattle, but cattle can only live where there's no tsetses. This Great Zimbabwe abruptly drops from the archaeological record at about 1500, and this coincides with a period of greater moisture, one that might have disrupted the cattle economy of the region by bringing in sleeping sicknesses. Even more than 1,000 years ago, the state of Axum in modern Ethiopia prospered on the basis of so-called second nature geography, being at the intersection of great trade routes, but also from the ability to manage its environment with kind of an elaborate water storage and irrigation system. But when I was a PhD student and doing the lit review for my dissertation, I came across a more specific story, one by Robert Bates, in which he proposed a so-called Ricardian theory of states in sub-Saharan Africa. His view was that the state provides peace and order, and the state, by providing peace and order, makes it possible to trade and produce. And so the gains from from promoting markets help explain why you'll see some states in some locations and no states or weaker states or less centralized states elsewhere. And so his view is that the gains from trade were biggest where products from one ecological zone could be traded for products from another ecological zone. And he did a small little test where across 34 African societies, it did look as though there were more likely to be kingdoms near ecological boundaries than away from them. And so the summer after I finished my PhD, I thought this was a story I could take to data. And so I went out to try and test it in a larger sample with more controls using the tools that are kind of known to economists. And so as my unit of observation, I took the ethnic groups that George Murdoch had mapped in his 1959 book on Africa. And so you can see in both figures this map. And I merged it to a variable that he had put into the ethnographic atlas that measured how many levels of jurisdiction there are in the state in a particular ethnic group. The idea here being that if there's no authority above the village, there's probably not much of the state. But if there's 4 levels of hierarchy beyond the village, that looks a lot like a centralized kingdom. And so you can see on the left, a map of the centralization as measured in his atlas. And you can see on the right, my main independent variable, my attempt to measure the gains from trade based on ecological zones. What I did was went out and found a map that the UN had put together on the vegetation zones, forest, Sahel, Sahara, in Africa, and I intersected the two polygons, the one set of polygons of African ethnic groups and the other set of polygons of African vegetation zones. And then I computed something called the Herfindahl index, basically a measure of the probability that if I go to any two sites within the territory of an ethnic group, I'll find a different kind of vegetation. If a state has, or if an ethnic group has a diverse ecology, it will be darker on the map on the right. It will have a more diverse set of vegetation, and so more things to produce and trade from one zone to another. Now, to convince my referees that I actually had exogenous variation in ecological diversity, that this wasn't just some relationship confounded by a third variable, I constructed an instrumental variable, a predictor of ecological diversity that took into account the variation over space and rainfall within different parts of an ethnic group's territory. What did I find? Well, I found quite consistently with Bates' hypothesis that areas of greater ecological diversity in pre-colonial Africa were the same that had greater pre-colonial states. Indeed, the magnitude of the correlation is one that, well, it's a bit hard to think about because you can see that states come in many different levels. And so I've just given you histograms here of above and below median diversity and the type of states that you see there. Well, the thought experiment I'd like to think about is take an ecologically homogeneous society, one like the Talensi or one like the Yako, and move them to the sort of region that a typically diverse, your normal, usual sort of diverse society like the Fur or the Wolof would have. The probability of having any sort of state would rise by about 10 percentage points if you do that. And so this was a correlation that I could throw a lot of robustness checks at. I could throw alternative measures of states at it, alternative measures of the gains from trade. I could use different statistical estimators. I could use the instrumental variable that I mentioned before, and I could test for the possible influence of alternative ways of estimating the data. And so what I found is that this really survived a fair number of robustness checks. Indeed, I believe the link between trade and states better explained what I found in the data than a bunch of possible alternatives, whether a society is bigger in its geographic scope, whether kingdoms conquered regions that were good for trade, whether within an area that has diverse ecology, a state would develop to protect the best land, whether this was all just a proxy for dense population, whether it was a proxy not for ecological but ethnic diversity, and whether areas of greater ecological diversity just have more droughts and other environmental risks. I think I was able to rule a lot of these out in the data through various robustness checks or just turning to the secondary history on Africa. Then in the last part of this paper, I went back to the paper that you saw yesterday, linking pre-colonial states to modern development, and used ecological diversity as an instrument for pre-colonial states, reconfirming the result that Elias and Stelios told you about yesterday, that past states within Africa matter for modern development, even at the sub-national level. Now, although I'm grateful for the opportunity to present a paper here and to talk about my own past work, I also have to revisit something that I wrote in 2014, and that's always dangerous because you go back and reread the paper and think, what was I thinking? I even write in the abstract, the results are robust to reverse causation, and boy, that's amateur, I can't believe I wrote that. So what, with the benefit of hindsight, would I have done differently as an economist looking at a story like that from African history? Well, one thing I might do is try to find additional ways to operationalize Bates' idea of how ecology can give rise to gains from trade. In the paper, I put together a diversity index. Was that really a better measure of trade than whether an ethnic group has territory that's basically divided 50-50 between two different vegetation types? I'm not sure. Would it have been better if I'd instead used distance from an ecological boundary, even if it's outside your territory? Maybe. Interesting recent work by Andrew Dickens doesn't look at all at ecological types or vegetation. He looks very particularly at what crops can be grown in some regions and what crops can't. Why didn't I use an index like that? I don't have a good answer. But as more and more data becomes easily available for economists to use, there's greater opportunity for economists to expand on and improve the measures of the potential gains from trade. I'm also not a huge fan of the fact that most of my empirics relied on the work of George Murdoch. I mean, he is, after all, an expert on the First Nation societies of the Pacific Northwest, not on Africa. And so it's not great that this is often the source that we have to rely on. And so there's some people out there who have done some pretty brilliant alternatives. I'm showing you one map right now, Emilio de Petra-Chalban, ignoring any of the literature that's in cross-cultural anthropology or done by people by Murdoch, instead took atlases of African empires over the past 1,000 years and coded a state history measure at the grid cell level. There's some really neat work pushing forwards what we know about African states. The other thing I think about with hindsight is that no one paper on a topic is ever definitive. You don't read one paper and conclude that this is a true story of the world. We need replication. And so I've been pleased to see that some other papers out there that have looked at the origins of states have sometimes carried around my ecological diversity measure as a control and found that the correlation I found in their paper on that one control variable continues to move around as positive and significant. Oded Galor and Mark Klemp, for example, have done this in a recent paper on autocracy. I can also be a little bit vague. I know some people are sending papers to science journals that don't let you circulate them before publication, but I know that others have used the link between ecological diversity and states to look at other questions, both within Africa and around the world. The second story I want to tell you about that I took to data in Africa was indeed not a story about Africa at all, but a story about Europe. The historian Charles Tilly, noting that war was incredibly common in Europe between 1500 and 1800, when the great powers were at war maybe 75% of the time, noted that in order to defend against this threat of war, rulers in Europe made a whole bunch of fiscal innovations that allowed them to raise more taxes. And so in his pithy phrase, war made the state and the state made war. And this sort of makes sense. The state can sometimes rise due to ratchet effects. It could become lower marginal cost to sustain a new fiscal innovation than the fixed cost of creating it. And so these increases in state capacity became durable, persisting over the long run, and by creating stronger states, maybe even leading to the anti-persistence of conflict. Places that had more conflict in the past having less conflict in the present because of the state building effects. Mark Dincheko has done some empirical work showing that across countries, this correlation seems to hold up in the data. But this is a story about Europe. We have reasons to suspect it might not hold in Africa. And so we know that pre-colonial states in Africa predict greater state capacity and less violence, but the story of past war leading to states and less violence in the present, that might not work in Africa. It's more sparsely populated, giving rise to raiding wars that have indefinite duration, rather than wars with set-piece battles that come to final conclusions. It might have changed the transatlantic slave trade, might have affected the nature of both war and states in Africa. And colonization might have disrupted the normal process of endogenous and indigenous state building that you would expect if the Tilly story were to hold for Africa. So Mark Dincheko and I, as well as some other co-authors, went to test whether the Tilly story holds in Africa differently than it does in the rest of the world. And so in this paper, we took as our unit of analysis the set of countries that exist in the old world, and as our main dependent variable, as our main measure of state capacity, we took the share of income taxes, as opposed to indirect taxes on things like trade, in total tax reckoning. We got that data from the IMF. We also considered the prevalence of civil war, the share of years from 1950 to 2000 that a country had experienced a civil war. Our main independent variable comes from a source that's freely available on the internet and that anyone in the audience can use, and that is Peter Brecka's catalog of all the conflicts that happened between 1400 and 1800. And so we counted how frequent were conflicts on a country's soil over that period. This wasn't a paper in which we had a nice natural experiment. And so to address the possibility of selection or of endogeneity, we showed robustness to controls and some tests about how sensitive our correlations were to those controls that give us some indication of how sensitive those correlations would be if we could literally control for everything that isn't in the data set. And so what we found is that indeed, the Tilly story doesn't really hold in Africa. Africa is different. Now, we do find that parts of Africa that had more conflict before 1800 had greater state capacity. And you can see that in this coefficient here. We are unable to reject that the coefficient is the same for Africa as it is for the rest of the world. And this holds across a variety of different measures of states. It does look as though war made the state in Africa as much as it did anywhere else. But we don't find the anti-persistence of conflict in Africa. We find the persistence of conflict in Africa, a pattern that isn't found in the rest of the world. To give you a sense of how big this is, a 1 standard deviation increase in past conflict exposure in Africa, or a 1 standard deviation increase in conflict exposure anywhere increases the income tax share by about 1/3 of a standard deviation, whilst an increase in war in pre-colonial Africa raises the prevalence of war in post-colonial Africa by more than a standard deviation. Now, Besley and Persson have given us a way to think about this, and we think that whereas in Europe, past warfare gave rise to so-called common interest states, within sub-Saharan Africa, it predicted the prevalence of special interest states. We also show in this paper that areas that had more war had more extensive railway networks before 1914, and that war was persistent within Africa from before the 19th century into the 19th century within Africa. Now, again, this is a more recent paper, but I've been given a bit of an opportunity to reflect on it. I think if I were to do anything different and if I were to speak to any of the aspiring economists in the audience, I certainly would not have written a cross-country paper. Audiences don't like cross-country regressions anymore. And I would have started with a paper where I had a nice natural experiment that increased exposure to conflict in some areas and not in others. People tend not to believe correlational studies so much anymore. Do I think, however, the results of this study fit well with what other researchers have found or what Mark and I have found in some of our other work? Well, I think that if you either read the secondary historical literature on Africa or some of my own work on violence in the slave trade, I think that this is consistent with that other body of work. I think it also is part of a broader story that you can see across lots of Mark Dinczekko's other work, that the story that war made the state and the state made war, and that you find state capacity and anti-persistence of conflict. We found that too in a paper about pre-colonial conflict in India. It seems like it's a mix of dense population densities and pre-existing political fragmentation that allow the Tilly story to take hold and show that it does generalize from outside of Europe, if not to the whole world. Further, there is some excellent work by Tim Besley and Marta Reynal-Clairol that has shown that there is persistence of conflict not only across African countries, but within African countries. The parts of the continent that experienced more conflict before the colonial period have also experienced more civil war afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, James. That was a wonderful presentation, and you spoke a lot to the issues that I'll be touching on as well. So let me pull up my slides. Well, it's really a pleasure to be with you today. Thank you so much to the organizers for putting this together and for having me speak. As Ilya said, I am an infectious disease doctor as well as an economist. And as an infectious disease doctor, we are the doctors that are very, very interested in the patient's history. So we want to know where they've traveled, what their occupation is, all different facets of their life, because it's extremely important to know their exposure history as it maps into different incubation periods and different diseases. So for me, thinking about history, both as an economist and as a physician, is extremely natural. However, given that we are in a pandemic and we're battling COVID-19 and it is increasing disparities worldwide, although my paper doesn't speak to that, I'm happy to have that discussion in the Q&A. Okay, what this paper does speak to is how an endowment, if you will, a disease endowment, affects agricultural productivity and long-run development. And the specific example that I'm talking about, which Professor Fenske so nicely previewed for us, is the tsetse fly, which is an insect that is unique to Africa and causes disease in livestock and humans. So now there is a parasitic infection that is in South America that is related to the tsetse fly, known as Chagas disease. You might have heard of American trypanosomiasis, but does not at all affect livestock and actually is transmitted by a completely different vector, a vector that is not quite as difficult to eradicate as the tsetse fly. But interestingly enough, and we can talk about this in the Q&A as well, with climate change, that vector is moving northward even into the United States. Back to this paper. My paper looks at what this older hypothesis from sort of agricultural economists and ecologists, entomologists even, that the tsetse fly hindered the ability of pre-colonial Africans to adopt the most modern at the time agricultural technologies, leading to those lower population densities that Professor Fenske alluded to. And then I also, again, look at that very important variable of pre-colonial centralization. So it's, again, no surprise that only since the industrial age have we really been thinking about, modern society and industry as leading economic growth. Throughout most of our history, agricultural productivity was seen as really central to economic development. And it even actually prompting the move towards industrialization through the ability to divide up labor. When all of your labor employment doesn't need to be in agriculture, when there's a surplus, then you can have people moving into different specialties. And this is what's known as the structural transformation as well, where people can then shift to the urban sector when there's surplus in the agricultural sector. And then there's a very old historical literature about how you actually have to have enough nutrition in order to actually be productive, and a nutrition poverty trap exists in the absence of that. There's another literature on the historical roots of Africa poverty related to low agricultural productivity, going back again to the land abundance arguments or the lower adoption of technologies. But in all of this, up to the point of my paper, I think, which is about a decade old at this point, the role of the tsetse hadn't really been explored rigorously. And there were very different views. So this is again from an entomologist who wrote a book entitled Africa's Bane, the tsetse fly. And Nash says, it seems reasonable to suppose that for hundreds of years, the tsetse dictated the economy of the African be based on the hoe as opposed to the plow, and the head load, so carrying things on the head, as opposed to having carts and oxen and all of that. And in fact, Nash went to say this was a dictatorship, which was only being freed by the development of the petrol engine and the railway locomotive. A counter view coming from economists was, though the argument about the tsetse fly is obviously relevant, it can only be a very partial solution to the puzzle of underdevelopment. And so this paper tries to make progress on this question. And I really loved Professor Fenske's sort of extremely thorough review of his own work. I wish I had added some critiques of my work here, because certainly there's room for improvement. But what I tried to do was I tried to understand the relationship between the tsetse fly and these pre-colonial outcomes, such as the use of cattle, the use of the plow, the patterns of agriculture, density, since how many people you can feed is how many people you can sustain, and then institutions. Again, if you can't use beasts of burden to carry loads and do the farming and whatnot, then that would sort of increase the opportunity and the incentive to enslave people in order to help kind of carry those loads and perform those tasks. And then the last part of the paper, which I think is a bit more suggestive, is does it affect economic outcomes today? And just by dint of the long run nature, I think that is more suggestive, but there's kind of some nice empirical exercise we might have time to get to. So for many in this audience, I think this is extremely common knowledge, but the tsetse fly is a blood-sucking insect vector. It only exists in Africa, and it harbors a parasite known as the trypanosome, which causes trypanosomiasis. And untreated, it's fatal to domesticated stock. This is known as Nagana colloquially, and in humans, it causes sleeping sickness. Now, livestock tend to be more affected than humans, and this is one picture to show that. These are humans standing sort of idly by while they use an ox as bait to kind of bring the tsetse fly forward and to try and sort of capture it for research purposes. And then the habitat, of course, tends to be in these more burdened areas. So the interesting thing about biology is that we have a lot of nonlinear relationships. So there tends to be sort of a Goldilocks point for various creatures to grow and crops to grow as well. And the tsetse fly kind of inhabits just that Goldilocks niche. So what I did in this paper is I was able to take advantage of some older entomological studies. These are bug scientists who had when actually British scientists started to try and inhabit and farm in African territory, they immediately encountered this barrier, the tsetse fly, and they did a lot of laboratory-based experiments, and this is now in the 1950s, early 1960s, to try and understand the biology. What are the optimal conditions under which the pupa survive? Now, just a little bit of a scientific side note. So the fly is a very interesting insect. If you recall back to your days of sort of high school or secondary school biology, there are two ways to reproduce. There are R strategists and K strategists. R strategists are like mosquitoes. Their strategy is just to produce in abundance, and some will survive and some will die. K strategists are humans, other animals, mammals that tend to put a lot of resources into each of their young. In fact, the tsetse fly is a K strategist. It puts a lot of resources in the form of this lipid pore that it puts into its pupa in order for it to survive. It doesn't produce a lot of pupa, but each one is very carefully maintained. And those pupa lie dormant in the ground and can only emerge under these very specific conditions. So all of that science is what I was able to exploit to create and put it together in sort of a demographic model that are now, obviously with COVID, I think we're all very familiar with birth rates and death rates and finding steady states of populations. And so I was basically able to bring those biological features of the insect physiology into a demographic model or an epidemiological model of the steady state of the fly's conditions. So here you can see those perfect temperatures for the pupa to survive. It's also less well related to humidity, but you put that all together and you get this pretty nonlinear relationship that then I just standardize and correlate with these various outcomes of interest that I mentioned, like agriculture, centralization, whatnot. So again, the hypothesis is that the tsetse fly would have affected the way that people could not use cattle. They could not use cattle byproducts such as the night soil that was used for organic fertilizer. And this led to a slash and burn agriculture, which takes up a lot more land and a lower population density, and increased transportation costs, et cetera. So here, basically, it's a simple, straightforward regression. I look at the outcomes wise on the left-hand side, my tsetse suitability on the right-hand side. Because I'm using temperature and humidity in this index, I control for all of the those same inputs, if you will, linearly. I control for higher order, sort of square terms, et cetera, et cetera. And I also use, as James said, there's a Professor Fenske said, there's a large literature on other factors, other environmental determinants at play. So I try to control as best as possible for those things as well. Okay, moving on to the results. So I'm just showing you my preferred specification. And so, I see this large reduction, about a 1 standard deviation unit in the tsetse fly leads to about a 1/3 reduction in the probability of having large domesticated animals. I'm using the same geographic unit that Professor Fenske showed you before, those ethnic groups that were mapped by Murdoch. And we know, again, the caveat is large with that, but this is the data we had. It also leads to about a 1/4 reduction in intensive agriculture. That's the notion of using the soil over and over again in the production process, as opposed to shifting to new locations each time you create a crop. Reductions in plow use, increases in female participation of agriculture. And I'm not sure if you've heard from Professor Nunn yet about his work, where the plow was used more, there was less female participation in agriculture. Lots of different reasons about that. So I'm sure you'll hear about that very soon. I do find reductions in population density, increases in indigenous slavery, and again, about a 1/4 reduction in this important pre-colonial centralization variable. So if we just look at things a bit more non-parametrically, we see increases in the Tsetse Suitability Index are associated with reductions in animal husbandry and also increases in hunting, slight increases in gathering and fishing. So basically, we're seeing kind of substitution across different modalities of production. Now, of course, I don't have a randomized controlled trial, and both as a development economist or a trained development economist and as a clinician, randomized controlled trials are wonderful, but they can't really answer a deep historical question like this. So what can we do? Well, we can perturb this Tsetse Suitability Index formula. I can shift it to the left and to the right, and was be expected by that sort of Goldilocks formula I showed you before. We don't actually see the same results. I can sort of assess for the presence of outliers. I can kind of use different standard errors. There's a big discussion, I think, that actually has come since I published this paper about what's the right level of adjustment. But basically, when we do these, when we shift things over, use sort of other ways of parameterizing the TSI, just use optimal Tsetse conditions, we either get the same results or don't get the same results in the way that we would have wanted to. Now, as Professor Fenske mentioned, we don't really think that this map that Murdoch put together is really, we're not sure if it's the ground's truth or not. And it actually, we don't have such a nice map outside of Africa. And to do what is a so-called placebo test, if the Tsetse only exists in Africa, then Tsetse suitability conditions should not predict the same outcomes outside of Africa. So in order to do this, I had to sort of generate what would be similar ethnic areas outside of Africa, when all I really had was the centroid, or these points. So there's a feature of GIS that allows you to do this, Thessian polygons, and it kind of figures out, what's the minimized distance from every point to the centroid that would then trace out the border. So I was able to make these polygons, these synthetic polygons, and use those across the world. And you can see that whether I use the map or these synthetic polygons within Africa, I get very similar answers. So reductions in domesticated animal use, intensive agriculture, so on and so forth. So similar to what James was showing you with his interaction, I can also interact the TSI with Africa. And again, the hypothesis I'm testing here is since the Tsetse fly is only in Africa, this suitability index shouldn't have explanatory power outside of Africa. And for the most part, that's exactly what I find. So I see very little action on the main effect of the TSI, and pretty much all of my action is coming from the interaction coefficient, suggesting there's something specific about what this is capturing within Africa. we already saw this, but this is just, when we try and I have a counterfactual in my paper about what would Africa look like, in the absence of the fly. I think that is not to be taken very seriously, quite frankly, but as Professor Fenske showed you, this is actually from an older paper, an older sort of scientific paper from an anthropologist, basically the outlines of Great Zimbabwe. And the border here is the line of maximal possible tsetse infestation. So basically, Great Zimbabwe's boundaries were where the tsetse fly could exist. Okay, last thing is just, is the tsetse suitability still dictating, if using the word of Nash, the outcomes in Africa today? So I look at both cattle as an outcome, that's panel B, and that satellite light luminosity, that's panel A. And basically what we see is that once I actually control for this measure of historical centralization, I don't see this very strong, robust correlation with the tsetse suitability index and luminosity today. However, I still see a strong, a correlation, a negative correlation between cattle and the tsetse fly today. So again, this is highly suggestive. So I wouldn't, this is just suggestive, I should say. So probably more work needs to be done. But there is now there's cattle dipping and other methods that people now use to try and mitigate the effects of trypanosomiasis, including using sort of dwarf cattle and different genetic hybrids of cattle that are quote unquote trypanosome resistent. So in the paper, I think it was a really nice project to do as an infectious disease doctor / development economist / historian, because it took this thing that I think that was, I believe, very top of mind for people that worked in agriculture, for example, in sub-Saharan Africa, and for top of mind for generations prior to that, and just tried to bring the best techniques we had 10 years ago to try and understand this question, and use some of the biology, of the intrinsic biology of the sort of evolutionary miracle of the tsetse. I mean, it's really a fascinating creature, to try and leverage that for identification, or to really understand the processes of development. And, again, the simulation, but mostly the archaeological record, as Professor Fenske mentioned, suggests that, this really did sort of circumscribe areas where you can have domesticated livestock with the migratory patterns in the Sahel, with Great Zimbabwe, et cetera. And to the extent that, do I think this is a first order, do I think the tsetse fly is a first order problem in terms of, or a first order factor explaining, areas of underdevelopment or poverty in Africa today? I don't think that is the case based on my research, but I still think that there's a huge role for disease more broadly, malaria, COVID, HIV, TB, especially when you think about the cumulative impact of all of these things. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, James. Thank you, Marcella. I think it's always fascinating to just dig deeper into the research and really understand what some of these factors are telling us. And I think James made the point that there isn't, or maybe it was Marcella, I can't quite remember, but there isn't one paper that tells the whole story. But as one explores these various factors and these various dynamics, the picture does start to emerge. And I think, this being week 2 of the program, we're still in the early stages of putting this complete picture together. So this really adds to our understanding and of the dynamics of pre-colonial Africa and what that means for us today. So as we anticipated, the question line has been abuzz with a lot of questions. And I want to just say to everybody before we jump into some of those questions that it's clear we won't be able to answer all of the questions in the time that we have. But the good news is that the Wheeler Institute team have committed to, over the course of the next 1 week, taking all of the questions and providing answers with them. And those will be posted on our website. So if we don't get to your specific question, please don't despair. The Q&A will be posted with questions over the next week. So James, Marcella will take some of the questions. I'll try and focus on questions that had more than one person asking them, so we kind of stick to themes, so to speak, and that might help us kind of address questions that had the most interest. So I think there's a set of questions, James, starting with you, around pre-colonial states. How are they organized? How do we define them? How do we, to what extent are they linguistically correlated? How exactly were these pre-colonial states defined and organized? Can you share some thoughts on that?
So I suppose I'd start off by pointing out, as some of the commenters have, that Africa is a continent and not a country, and there are as many types of African states as there are African states. And so you could have very kind of loose systems as existed amongst the Bemba that, although there are several levels of jurisdiction above the local, the guy at the center is not particularly powerful or able to tell the chiefs under his nominal authority to do very much. Well, on the flip side, you'll have central monarchs like the Oba of Benin, or the, of course, I blank when I'm in a big presentation, the Kabaka in Uganda, who actually had quite strong central authority. I think this is both a challenge and an opportunity for this literature, in that I have to take as given the data that exists for me to code. And because this anthropologist based at Yale in the 1950s felt like coding levels of jurisdiction, it's what I've been able to work with. And because he felt like coding it at the ethnicity level, that's the level at which I can measure it. There's some ambiguity here, though, of course. Ijebu and Egba are coded as separate groups in his data set, when maybe they should have just been one group called Yoruba or called Oyo. But people like Emilio de Petres Chalvin have been able to go out and get sources that are independent of ethnicity and code measures of states on that basis in a way that circumvents the problem of missing multi-ethnic states. You're muted.
Thanks so much, James. I'm going to try, instead of doing the questions chronologically, I'm going to try and kind of alternate between the two speakers, except of course where there's a continuing theme. But maybe this is a question that both speakers would want to take a crack at. A number of questions are coming through around this use of ecology, ecological diversification as a correlating factor to determine many other outcomes, right? As a measure of centralization, and there's some sense that this might not be quite complete or quite accurate, may have a lot of noise in it. Why the use of ecology, and why is it so important in this work?
I will start, and I would just mention that there are so many on this panel that have done such a fantastic work that that I will keep my comments brief, and including Professor Fenske. So I'm excited to hand the baton off to him. But I think, Mamelo, it's really a pendulum in which sometimes, ecological factors are thought to be very prominent. Sometimes it sort of swings more to, for lack of a better word, man-made factors, institutional governance. It's nice to see how those, it's sort of the frontier, in my view, to think about how those two things really work together. I can say that, as a clinician, what has struck me when I work in vulnerable communities in the United States, or have worked in antiretroviral clinics in sub-Saharan Africa, just the fragility of life, and how infectious diseases really, disease in general, but infectious diseases and the vectors and the ecology that promotes them really distort behaviors in a way is extremely prominent. And yet in some, and yet when it doesn't really necessarily need to tax my mind here in 20-degree weather in Boston. And so I think what's interesting to me about COVID is that it's just this huge shock. We're here, we're all virtual, for example, and it's kind of a reminder about the power of infectious diseases and their ability, their versatility, and their genetics, which are extremely fascinating, but also dangerous. So I think I see this more as a pendulum that kind of moves back and forth with the times, and it's nice to also see the dialogue now kind of coming together between the two.
Yeah, thanks, Marcella. James, your view?
So I think I can break your question into two. Are the data on geography accurate? And are the data on geography important? And this lets me touch on two things that I saw in the Q&A that haven't come up yet, which are, why are we looking at the whole continent? And isn't this determinism? So on the one hand, the data are extremely accurate. They are put together by scientists, not economists, who specialize in understanding agriculture, who specialize in mapping geography. And so we can measure them very, very well for the whole continent because they make them available for the whole continent. And so they can be merged with any other data source, but also because referees in economics care about general stories, not particularities. If you give them an excellent study of Busara, Kenya, you'd better well be running a randomized control trial with extreme internal validity, or they'll demand external validity. I get asked, why aren't you looking at the rest of the world as well? Just as often as I get asked, why are you looking at all of Africa? But on another side, the data are extremely inaccurate. My map of African vegetation comes from the 1980s. Many of the studies that look at suitability for growing a certain crop use data that was put together by the Food and Agriculture Organization 20 years ago, not 200 years ago. And yet they use these data to explain states that existed in the past. And you have to make an appeal to an argument that these geographic conditions are relatively slowly changing, and that any measurement error you get from measuring something in the present rather than in the past must only be biasing your correlations towards insignificance rather than systematically creating them. On the second question of, are the data important? Are we looking at the right variables? Well, I think I can tell you that with a thought experiment from one of the papers I talked about, if you took a typically undiverse African society and put it in an ecologically diverse region, you'd raise its probability of having a state by 10 percentage points. That's both substantial and not 100. And in regression speak, the R squared is a lot less than 100%. So we're clearly not explaining everything. Indeed, what economists often focus on, not so much macroeconomists, but many of the labor economists and microeconomists, is estimating treatment effects. We're not often setting out to answer the question, why are there African states? Even though I'll put it in my title and pretend that's what I'm doing. Instead, what we're asking is, what is the effect of this one measurable treatment on African states, holding as much else constant? And so we're measuring effects, but I don't think we're saying that there's any determinism that these are the only things that determine African states.
Yeah, thanks so much, James. And I think this, I was going to come back to this question around the risk of determinism. And I think, when you think of the aspirations of Africans today, typically we want to be free of this kind of determinism and feel a sense of agency and the ability to shape our own future. Is there a risk that we're going into determinism? And if so, how do we counterbalance that with a sense of self-determination that many Africans want to hold on to today? Marcella?
Well, Mamela, we were just sharing prior to you coming on this fantastic news in Nature about the Afrigen in South Africa creating, on their way to replicating the Moderna vaccination. So I feel like there is no sense. So again, I think history is important for helping us understand where we came from and understand that there are roots of inequality, and that, that it is a lottery where you are born, and people have different experiences and different intergenerational experiences that help explain patterns that we see today. But then history is fixed, if you will. And then what you sort of do with that and what the world does with that, to put it in regression terms, the history is the X's. What we do with that is the betas. And that's we can both understand, helping us understand that in no way it's not necessarily destiny. It's just an acknowledgement that some patients have different exposures that puts them more at risk. Some countries have different exposures that puts them more at risk for some things versus others, some populations, et cetera. And so I think helping to understand that as sitting in a policy school helps us to craft the right policies to help overcome the various challenges that we face in a precise way. And it's just very exciting to see the developments in Afrigen.
Yeah, I'm really glad you mentioned that, Marcella, because I think a lot of the questions, and I'm speaking as a participant in the course and speaking, I suppose, on behalf of the other participants in the course, is in very front of mind for many of us is, what is the bearing of what we're learning on the outcomes today and of course on the future? And I think that, that is a theme that's going to kind of continue to permeate throughout the lectures. And I think I'll encourage everybody to keep that in mind as we learn more, right? And perhaps towards the end of the lecture, we could have a richer discussion about what that means, having, not fully explored, but having explored in more depth the historical side. James, can I come back to you? There are a number of questions here about pre-colonial conflict, right? Where were the biggest conflicts? What was the nature of that conflict? How do we know whether there was more or less conflict in some areas? And a recap again of what that means for today. How are we able to make that link to conflict in Africa in recent times?
Right. And so this is a few questions. Where is there more conflict in the African past compared to where is there less conflict in the African past? What we did was took out basically one long Excel spreadsheet that a political scientist has put together from every encyclopedia or dictionary of conflict he can find, listing all the different events that had happened since 1400. And coding those to modern countries, it pops out from the data that in countries like Angola, Nigeria, Zimbabwe, there's a much higher prevalence of conflict than if you were to go inland into places like Niger or the Central African Republic. The second question, how do we link that to conflict in the present? And I can give you a pithy answer of, well, statistically, in that in the paper that I wrote with Mark, we worked at the country level and asked whether a greater prevalence in the past correlated with greater prevalence today, and it did. But that was a correlation that only held within sub-Saharan Africa. A much more interesting and better paper was by Tim Besley and Marta Querol-Reinal that not only looked at cross-country correlations, but within countries, you see that same story of a greater persistence. They argue that this works in part through immiserization, if conflict leads to poverty and poverty leads to conflict, and partly through a culture of greater distrust.
Okay, thank you. Marcel, I'm going to come back to you.
Sorry, And if anybody wants to just check in the data, not only is Peter Brecka's data available online, all of my data is on my website.
Perfect. Thanks for the additional reference, and I think a lot of people will definitely follow up on that. Marcel, I want to come back to you. Your paper was quite specific on the tsetse fly, and a couple of questions coming through, and maybe I'll group them. I'll give you 3 categories of questions. The first one being, why this particular parasite? I think a lot of folks are asking about malaria or the mosquito, for example, ticks and other potential parasites. Why the tsetse fly specifically? And then some questions around the impact of the tsetse fly today. Is it still as an important factor in determining outcomes today, or has that changed? Let me leave it there.
Yes. So, and if I can just add a little footnote to the question before to give a specific example about how history can possibly shape how we can think about history from the United States. So one of my papers, one of the papers I worked on was on the Tuskegee syphilis experiment, which was a historical experiment that existed in the United States. It actually built off the work of Professor Wanchicon and Nunn on the origins of mistrust in Africa, looking at this really terrible event in the US history of deceiving Black men, experimenting on them. Your audience is probably maybe very well aware of this terrible experiment. And in one paper, I showed how it really eroded trust in the medical community. And then because of that, we tried to think about an intervention, increasing the diversity of medical professionals that could be extremely beneficial for African-American men. And so that's the way I think, in any way, we can see a link between history and policy, not in a defeatist or deterministic fashion, but in a sort of precise policy relevant fashion. So this is a very, again, advanced audience, knowing all of the different parasites and ticks and other illnesses that exist. And what I found very unique about the trypanosome parasite versus, for example, the malaria parasite was the effect that it had on livestock. Ticks have that too, but it had this very specific geographic representation in sub-Saharan Africa that we just don't see. So American trypanosomiasis, there is a version of it in South America, but it doesn't have the same impact on livestock or anything close to that. So in some sense, going back to Professor Fenske's remarks, I think it would be, we're limited in some sense by the confines of what we can do with the data that we have at hand and the questions that we can actually answer. I think if I'm looking towards disease modelers, someone that could actually integrate over all of the disease exposures, the malaria, the tick-borne illnesses, the trypanosomiasis, and so on and so forth, I think the sum total of that, it still might not explain all of the variation whatsoever in historical development, but I think, I'm looking at a partial effect of one disease that I tried to get good identification on, and I focused on that parasite given its impact on livestock and the narrative that had developed around it. What about the impact of the tsetse fly today? I believe it's still a huge factor. So if you look at ILRI, the International Livestock Research Institute, based out of East Africa, I mean, there's pages and funds and papers all about different tactics that farmers have to use in order to try and avoid trypanosomiasis and keep their cattle safe. So it's still very, very costly for agriculture. It's just the role of agriculture in the overall economy isn't quite as large as it was before, though of course, there's a huge subsistence economy that I think I would be remiss not to mention as well. I would also say that now there is no vaccine for sleeping sickness, as everyone knows. Again, the biology is fascinating. This particular parasite has a lot of antigenic variation. So why were we able to find a vaccine for COVID-19 within a year, and we're still struggling with neglected diseases like trypanosomiasis? Well, I'm sure there's a political economy explanation, but it's also the wiliness of this particular parasite, always changing its coat and whatnot. But there is an actual genetic variation, almost very similar to malaria, in this apolipoprotein that sits, that can actually insert itself into the parasite and cause it to explode. That exists among some African populations. How does that affect once, there is a trade-off though. So that actually leads to more kidney disease today. So we still actually have, even if you move outside of Africa, there's still the echoes of exposure to sleeping sickness in higher rates of kidney disease in populations that have been sort of Tsetse exposed in the past.
Thank you so much. Marcella, when you started your talk, you invited questions about the impact of infectious disease outbreaks and so on, based on the other work that you're doing. A few questions have come in on that. One question says, as COVID and other infectious outbreaks like Ebola had an impact on conflict in Africa, and also what were the effects of the Spanish flu on the African continent in the early 1900s, and to what extent does that inform or correlate to what the effects of COVID are today?
That's a fantastic question. So I think in what I love about it is it's really sort of, again, bringing together disease and political economy in a way that is quite sophisticated, I think. I have a student here at the Kennedy School who has been looking at the time from the first COVID case was reported and within state conflict in different countries in Africa. And I can send the reference to the organizers, the Wheeler Institute, afterwards if you'd like to see it. But it basically shows that once COVID was reported in the media, so the argument of my student, Mitsuru, is that this was a sign of potential weakness for the state, and there were more sort of attacks by rebel forces, et cetera, and civil conflict that occurred in that moment of time. So that is a possible hypothesis that the state, anything that kind of disrupts the state or would lead to resources being diverted from sort of keeping the peace to other activities such as disease outbreaks, could really pose a threat. And so that's one paper I've seen, a working paper on COVID. There's some very nice work on Ebola in the Economic Journal and how that has affected political institutions and these disruptions. And I think, I think again, what's interesting about the COVID situation, not that I would wish, 1 million dead in the United States alone, over 1 million in excess death. When you think about the way, though, it has driven home how there really can be an interaction between a shock of this magnitude, a disease, infectious disease, and democracy, and how it's really kind of highlighted the frictions. I think it has exposed for people that might not be familiar with infectious diseases in their day-to-day life. It's really exposed some of the struggles that states that have been living with infectious diseases for a very long time have had to deal with these outbreaks and epidemics and so on.
I can't believe how quickly this time is flying past. I think we probably have time for one more question, and I'm going to take a theme that kind of is emerging in some of the questions and maybe add a little bit of a stretch to it, Prof. Venske, and say, when you talk about the strength of pre-colonial states and the impact on the post-colonial states, of course, there's this big disruption in the middle, which is the colonial intervention. And if you could, I don't know if you've thought about it or done some work on it, and if you could share thoughts on perhaps a counterfactual of how those pre-colonial states could have developed had this disruption or this shock not taken place, would we see, or in what ways would we see a different Africa today, or in what ways could have the continent developed differently if that shock hadn't been part of the mix?
So there's an old joke in statistics that prediction is hard, especially out of sample. And so for me to try to extrapolate would be wild speculation. I think there are two cases we can sort of think of as examples of what might have been: Ethiopia and Botswana. You'll often hear it said that Ethiopia was never colonized. That's only slightly true. The Italians were there for a bit of time in the 30s, but it wasn't long. And although Mattia Bertozzini has done some work showing long-run effects of the Italian occupation, we could argue that that was a state that survived into the post-colonial period without much, quote-unquote, colonial influence. It's also a bit of an instructive case of why you might not want to extrapolate too far, because although this state does survive until the 1970s, it's then swept away by a communist revolution, and perhaps that legacy hasn't been as durable as one would think. The second is Botswana. There's a very famous paper by Dron Acemoglu and Jim Robinson pointing out that there, colonialism was somewhat light touch. I joke that Botswana is like Reading, that you don't actually stop there. The colonialists just kind of wanted to pass through there. For Americans, the joke is New Jersey. And so they didn't really transform much of the institutions. And because of the rather open system of kagotlas that existed before, and the fact that chiefs that gave their legitimacy to the post-colonial state benefited from the exports of hides, they didn't have anti-export policies. And you actually have one of Africa's biggest development successes being a country that, while not colonized, was one in which institutions were somewhat left to develop on their own.
So I think that was a wonderful answer. And, you know, we showed maps of Great Zimbabwe, and there was a simulation in the paper. And even with the best sort of structural IO model, I don't think we would get all the general equilibrium features right with this counterfactual. But I would just, I think what that sparked for me as a question is, you know, the experience, the very differing experience of growing up in different parts of Africa and the differential exposures. I mean, this is actually something to embrace. It's just a very exciting continent with a lot of diversity. And I'm not sort of interested in the counterfactual anymore. I'm just so happy to see, you know, what comes next for people who identify as Africans.
All right, well, unfortunately, we have to close now. The good news is that it's been an incredibly rich discussion, incredibly rich. And it's just a pity that we didn't have another 5 hours. I think we could have continued into the night. So I really want to thank you both for sharing your work with us, engaging in the questions that have come through from all of our participants. And thank you in advance to the team that will take all the other questions that we couldn't get to. I mean, we had close to 200 questions coming in today, and those questions will be answered and posted, like I said, on the website. So thank you very much to everybody for joining. Elias, over to you.
Thank you, Mamelo. Thank you, James, and thank you, Marcella. We are very, very pleased that you took the time and present your very exciting research, and Mamelo for masterfully coordinating with so many questions. Let me thank all of our friends for sending us all the questions. I saw that Nathan, the teaching fellows, Stelios, Leonard were trying to address as many as can on top of what James and Marcella were doing. So as Mamelo pointed out, in our weekly Q&A, we will try to address most of them, not necessarily all of them, but most of them. Some quick remarks. Let me just remind you that tomorrow we have a special session zooming on data. We will be glad to have with us Tanner Regan from the London Business School, who will present various modern approaches to capture and reflect contemporary African development. Some will be using satellite images like the ones that Stelios presented yesterday. Some other techniques measure the quality of houses' roofs. We'll discuss survey data, census, and various approaches that can be used to approximate contemporary spatial development. Obviously, those applications will be relevant outside Africa as well. Many of the questions that we are receiving, and Nathan, Leonard, Stelios, and I are very pleased about those questions, is about the colonization, about the period that has been coined as Africa's slave trades or the scramble for Africa. Actually, we will be discussing for many weeks about those issues. We are just warming up and getting started, so we are very pleased with your engagement. Next week, we will pass the floor to Nathan Nunn, and we will start zooming into the more informal or cultural aspects of African societies related to family structure, kinship, lineage. And the week after, we will start discussing the period that has been coined as Africa's slave trades. So we look forward to meeting you tomorrow, where we will discuss data, and next week, where we will zoom on African culture. We have also scheduled a special lecture. We get so many requests for special lectures that we're actually deeply happy about it. We will have a discussion with Leonard van Sinkon. So we'll try to see African history through his remarkable life, which is an inspiration, at least for the three of us and many others. So we look forward to meeting you tomorrow and next week. Keep sending us emails on the course email. We want to hear from you. Let me further remind the questionnaire that was sent on Monday. We will let it open for 2 weeks. We understand that it is somewhat time consuming, but we think it's a remarkable opportunity to get your views and your feelings felt and recorded, and we'll try to portray some of those statistics in later lectures of the course. Thank you all very much.